We have our hard baits, couple of top waters, and then some shallow diving crankbaits. We have some rooster tails right here. And then some pre-molded swim baits. Then we have a couple of different jig head and hook options, some baby shad, and then some different types of tubes, creatures, and grubs, our swim baits, our stick baits, some more top water, bladed jig, and then up here we have some flies. So we're going to start with what I use the most consistent in Oklahoma and what I consider to be your best overall bait. And that's going to be our different types of tubes that we have. So this is what's called a Squirmin Squirt, and it's in green pumpkin with red and black flake. Now, this is going to mimic our bait fish that we have in Oklahoma. It's going to mimic our crustaceans that we have in Oklahoma, and it may even, you know, a fish may mistake it for some type of, you know, bug. If it's a stonefly or something like that, when it's moving through the water, you have your back end tail, and depending on how you fish it, you know, this is either going to look like the back end of a crawfish, or it's going to look like a bait fish fleeting if you're moving it quick. But this color in particular and this bait is your most versatile. We have a few different sizes of them. So this is a 2 1/4 inch, which is your bigger size, and you can fit a 1/16 ounce or an 1/8 ounce jig head inside of it. And then we have our 2 inch, which is about the same as the 1.5 inch body size. It's just a little bit longer tail on the back end. Now, in most Oklahoma streams, the 2 inch is going to be about all you need, with either a 1/16 ounce jig head or a 32nd ounce jig head, depending on how fast the water's moving. But to give a natural appearance, which is what we're looking for when we're in a stream, that's what your target is you really want to be trying to mimic the natural species that these fish are preying on. And so in Oklahoma, the most sought after warm water species in clear water streams are going to be smallmouth bass, spotted bass, and to some extent largemouth bass. Then you're going to have all different species of sunfish, and then you're going to have some non-game fish. You're going to have buffalo, drum, gar, red horse, and then some river suckers that you can pick up with some of these same baits. Now, these jig heads, it doesn't come this way. So it comes as a singular tube. And it'll come in a pack that looks something like this. Just crappie max, Squirmin Squirt. And in order to rig these, you want to buy what are called squirt heads. Bass Pro, it's a Bass Pro brand. They're shaped like this. They fit really well as opposed to something like this that has a head on it. Now you can use this, but this having that lead body through the middle, when fish bite it, if they bite it on something like this and they get it down here, they're able to tear it more because they get a lot of air that's in there. So when they grab it, they're ripping it. So using the appropriate jig head for a tube that looks something like that is going to get a longer lifespan per fish. So in a stream, you should be able to catch, you know, barring any type of fluke where you hook up on a log, or you just get a fish that really just shredded it, you're probably going to get, you know, 10 to 15 fish out of one before you need to change it up, before they've destroyed it. Now, rigging them, because it's internal, it's not something where a lot of baits, you know, you hook it through the head and then you're working it through. These you actually work through the underside into the belly of the bait. And so what you do is you take the eye hole, it's right here, and you stick that right into the base of the lure, or into the base of the bait. And all you're doing is you're just working that plastic all the way over that jig head. And then you pop the eye hole out right there at the top. And there you go. So what I'll do is I'll go buy a half dozen packs of the right color and the right size that I want to use, along with the corresponding jig heads. And I'll go load them all back into one singular pack. So these come in a 15 pack, and there's probably 40 that are pre-rigged in here. So when I go wet wading on a stream or I'm in a kayak, I don't have to worry about having a bunch of tackle boxes and things like that. I can just slide this right into my top pocket, and then all I need is some pliers and some nippers, and that's it. And I pretty much don't use anything but these on streams in Oklahoma. That's just my preference. I've had the most success with that. But we'll now go through some of the other types of baits that we have that will prove successful in most clear water streams in Oklahoma. And when we're talking about clear water streams, areas that have public access that are good stream fisheries from early May, mid-May through mid-October are going to be starting in the Northeast. We have Sycamore Creek, Buffalo Creek, the Elk. Those are all tributaries of Grand Lake. And as we work our way farther south, we get into the upper Illinois, which is a difficult fishery for most of the summer because it's a outfitter, with float trips. So most of the people who are on the water at any given time are not anglers. And so you get a lot of congestion on the river, and that makes fishing difficult, not only from a safety perspective, but fish just get a little shell shocked. They get all that traffic throughout the day. So the best time to fish the upper Illinois are going to be that late April, last couple weeks of April, all through the month of May until you hit about Memorial Day. And then you're going to get all your river rafters and summer floaters for a few months. And then generally by about the first week of October, depending on how much it's cooled down. This year, September, it's gotten much cooler. So float trips have died down closer to Labor Day as opposed to October 1st, but it's hit or miss depending on the year. So the Illinois is a great fishery all of October. If you're looking for overall quality of smallmouth bass, you're going to get into the most numbers of fish that are going to be over 14 inches. And anything in a river that's over 16 is a trophy river fish. And you can get into, depending on the day, depending on your angling level, I mean, you might get into 24 fish that are over 14 inches, which is a really good day on the water. And continuing to move south, Barron Fork Creek, which runs in to the lower Illinois, or the upper Illinois, excuse me. It has 2 public access sites on it, with a third one coming. Your average size smallmouth in there is going to be somewhere between 8 and 12 inches, with the opportunity to catch a fish up to about 15, maybe 16 inches. You get some movement of fish between the Illinois system working their way up the Barron Fork, especially during spawning season. So you might find a fish that's 16 inches, but the average size fish is going to be 8 to 12, which puts it right around a half-pound fish. Finding any fish over 2 pounds in the Barron Fork, especially the farther upstream you move, is very rare. There are a few fish that exist, but it's not the consistency that you would see in the upper Illinois. The lower Illinois is kind of a different fishery because it's a tailwater. And so during the summer months, you're going to have your striper fishermen that will move into there. And most of the stuff we're talking about doesn't really apply to stripers. It's focusing mainly on black bass, sunfish species, and then non-game fish. So then we get south of I-40, and then we're looking at the Little Lee, the Lee, the Upper Mountain Fork, the Lower Mountain Fork, the Glover River. And then if we move a little bit farther west, we have Rock Creek that runs into the north end of Arbuckle Lake, and all of that is wadable, and there's public access. And then the Blue River. And other than the upper Illinois, the Blue River is going to be your best opportunity at catching a smallmouth that's over 2 pounds. You might find one in Rock Creek just because, again, out of Arbuckle, you'll get some movement up that creek in the summer. It's spring fed, so fish that get warm, they want to get out of that stagnant water, low oxygen, so they'll move up into these creek basins. And you can find a bigger fish in there, but Blue River and Upper Illinois are your 2 smallmouth destinations for streams and creeks that are really going to produce average, bigger sized fish. The Glover, you can find good fish in as well. And wade fishing, you know, you're trying to limit your tackle and things like that. So being able to produce a lure or a bait that you feel confident with, that you can catch fish consistently, you know, makes for a better day of fishing, whether it be wade fishing or being in a kayak, because you want to simplify your baits. And in streams, you can really do that. So the next one we'll go to is just a basic single curly tail grub. This is kind of thought of as one of the, you know, original smallmouth bass catching lures, baits. Very simplistic. What this is mimicking is a bait fish. This is a fat Albert in root beer pumpkin or root beer pepper green. What this is mimicking is long ear sunfish, which are very consistent and prolific in most clear water streams in Oklahoma. So a smallmouth bass's diet is going to consist of crayfish and then bait fish, but they're the ones they have the most opportunity to get are going to be long ear sunfish. And so that's what this is mimicking. And so really your best option with this in most creeks is going to be a 16th ounce or an 18th or an 1/8 ounce jig head. Now there's a couple of different options. So this is called a stinger jig head. This is an 1/8 ounce. And as you can see, the difference between your standard 1/8 ounce jig head with the straight hook, this one is more of an offset and it comes out. And anybody who fishes for smallmouth bass consistently will tell you that pound for pound, they're probably the hardest freshwater biting fish, and they just have a tendency to go airborne and throw hooks very easily. This stinger hook gives you a little bit better opportunity. That hook point is pointed back straight at your eyelid. So when you're reeling that fish in, it's hooked anywhere in the mouth. It's just giving you that little bit extra than your typical U shape, which can get worn around and it's easier to pop out. So they both have their places, but I prefer a stinger hook if I'm using a jig head for anything. And so when you're rigging your grub, all you're doing is you're going to run. Now you always want to rig the hook through the top side. So when it's sitting like this, that fat part that works under, that's your back. That's the back side of the bait or the underside of the bait. So when you work your jig head through the top, it should be sitting like this. So when you put that jig head through the top and you work it down the body of the bait, and these soft plastics, they actually have a seam on them and you can see it. So you want to poke that hook point out right through that seam down the body of the bait and then work it up on to where it holds so that it ends up looking like that. And that's the proper way to hook or to rig that type of jig head. So when it's swimming through the water, this tail catches water and it looks like that when it's moving through. And that just looks like a baby sunfish swimming through. Our next one that is also very effective, especially if you work your way into places like the Ozarks, northern Arkansas, where you have some bigger fish and kind of some more wading opportunities and things like that, are what are called flukes. So we have two different flukes here. This is just your original fluke, and then this is a super fluke. It's a little bit bigger body. Now there's a couple of different ways you can rig these types of lures to use in a stream. I prefer fishing them weightless, leaving them up towards the top. And what will happen is if it falls in weightless, and by weightless, I mean we're just putting it on an offset hook with no weight. So there's no jig head, there's no bullet weight, there's no split shot. And we just rig this like you'd rig your basic bass hook setup to fish weightless or to fish weedless in a pond or a lake. So you're just poking through the top of the head, then you pop it right out the top of the head. And you work it up the hook all the way to the top of the eyelid and spin it around. Oops. Want to work that out through the bottom of the head to turn it. So your flat back, when you put it on the hook, should be faced. That hook point when you put it on should be on the belly of the bait. So when you work it up, you're just turning it onto your eyelid, and then you work it through the underside of the belly, and it'll pop right out the top like that. And then you just slightly bed it back into the body of the bait, and that'll keep it weedless. So when you pitch that out, instead of having weight, it's going to land on the surface of the water like this, and it's slowly going to submerge. But with that current, what it's going to do, because you're fishing angled across the current, is it's going to be facing you, and all you're doing is just kind of very, very slowly reeling, if reeling at all, and allowing that current to let it sink. And as it sinks, that back of that tail is going to be kicking like that. And what that mimics is a dying shad or bait fish that's either been wounded by another fish, any number of factors. If you spend enough time on a stream and you're just watching, you'll see fish drifting down occasionally that have either been hit by a bird, or another fish has tried to get it, or they've just died of natural causes. And as that fish is working its way through, again, a natural presentation, if we had weight on this, it's going to be moving through the water column unnaturally, because we're not swimming it. We're just wanting it to get a little light tail action on the back. And those bass will come up and they'll grab it from behind. And when they do, that weedless part right there that we have, when they bite down on it, exposes the hook point as you're setting the hook. Now, these are great. This is obviously not trying to naturally mimic something. This could be any number of bait fish that are in there. Really, this is a reactionary strike, and smallmouth bass are often reactionary strikers. They're looking upward. So any disturbance at the surface of the water or just subsurface can draw a bite. Exploratory, again, living in a stream, competition is heavy. So eating is the number one focus of these fish throughout the course of the day. So something like this for a fish can be seen as a high caloric intake. And while it might not look very natural in the water, you don't often see, you have lots of shiners and other types of micro species of fish that live in a body of water that are creating that flash. And then with sunlight or on a cloudy day, this pearl white is going to take on a couple of different scales of color depending on what's hitting it. And so these are great options for reactionary bites. And a lot of times these will draw some of your bigger fish out of a hole. So fishing them on a seam, especially if you have a riffle section that's running onto a bend in a river, casting it to that far bank where that current's coming through catches your line. So the second that your fluke hits the water and it's just kind of hovering there for a second and your line is starting to get caught by the current, it'll give it a couple of quick whips and you'll get a big fish that'll come up. And a lot of times your lure hasn't even gotten subsurface yet, so you actually see the strike as if it's fishing top water. Now you can always, of course, rig it with a jig head and fish it like a swim bait. So again, you're just going to take this and you're going to work it all the way onto the hook shank. So you're going to work it all the way up through the plastic and then pop it through. That might be a little much. So you can see there's a little bit of a bend in there, and that's okay right there. But really what you're looking for anytime you're using a jig head is you want that hook point to come through the bait where it's going to create close to a straight line. So the first one was probably a little bit too far, and that one's probably just a little too short. And that just comes with practice of knowing exactly, where to work it through to get that really good looking presentation where you can keep it straight like that. So that's just a jig head. So you would just cast that straight out and either steady retrieve it in and that tail would kick a little bit, or you could jig it to where it's popping up off the bottom, which would mimic different types of river shiners that you'll see big schools of them in that clear water where their tails are kind of up because they're feeding right off of the bottom. So a lot of times You know, they're grouped together for safety, because to predatory fish, when they see a school of fish, to them it looks like one big entity. So they're not necessarily as keen on going in and trying to grab a singular fish. But if you can work this, if you see a big school of shiners or something like that, that's near either a drop off or a pool or a run section, you know, you might cast right on the backside of them and work it down to the bottom and kind of pop it away from that school of fish. And now that you have a singular one, you're more likely to draw a predator strike, that it's away from the school of fish. So another option that a lot of bass anglers like to use, just your little stick worms. So this is just a yum dinger. There's two different. So here's the 5-inch and the 4-inch size. They actually make one that's even smaller, that's about a 3-inch. And you have a couple of different options for fishing these in a stream. You could run them directly onto a jig head, and it'd be the same way, where you're just working it down through the head of the bait and then working the plastic all the way up on to the shank of the hook. And then it's just like that. And you could fish that in, again, a straight steady retrieve. But what most people do is you're casting at a 45-degree angle upstream from you, letting it land, and then you're just pulling the rod tip up. So all this is doing is it's sitting on the bottom like this, and then you're popping it up and it's falling. Then it's popping it up and it's falling. And those bass will come down and either grab it on the hop, or that steady right there, they'll come down and get it, and you'll watch your line go tight. Another good way of rigging these that you can either do weightless or a piece of split shot is you can wacky rig it. So for a wacky rig, this is a wacky rig hook. It's very circular, very small. And you put that right through the center of the bait. So you go up through the bottom of it, and it would sit like that. And you can either do this weightless, or you could take a piece of split shot, and you could put that split shot about 6 inches up on the line. What this will do is, as it's going through the water, as it's falling, it pulsates. So it creates that little bit. So again, you could either just steady, slow retrieve, and it'd just be popping along the current like this, or you can let it fall down to the bottom and bounce it, then it'd slowly flutter back down and then bounce up, slowly flutter back down. Then a couple of other good options in Oklahoma are twin tail grubs. This one obviously doesn't have a skirt. This one has a skirt at the top. These ones do not have a top or a bottom, so you're not looking to run the hook point through. You're just going to run it out the side that's perpendicular to where your legs are at. So instead of the hook coming out the side where the legs are, you want them coming out to where that hook point is perpendicular to the legs. So your leg should be laying straight down and the hook should be going that way. So again, you're just working that through the head of the bait, work it through the plastic, and then up the hook shank. And then it looks like that. This is meant to be fished to where you cast it out into preferably a deep pool. So you're casting downstream, as opposed to casting, most of the time in stream fishing, you're trying to cast upstream because you want that natural presentation of bait coming down in those seams. But when you get into deeper holes and you're trying to mimic creature baits, maybe a frog, something like that, that, you know, would have the ability more so to swim back up into current, you're casting this one straight downstream, letting it fall all the way to the bottom. And then all you're doing is you're slowly lifting the rod tip up, all the way up, and it just kind of very slowly is doing this. And in the current, these legs are fluttering all like this, and then it falls slowly back down to the bottom. And then again, just picking up, and then it's slow. And each time that you do that, when it falls back down, you just reel up the slack and then slowly pick it up, let it fall, reel up the slack until you get back in. That type of fishing, you're going to feel the bite really good. A lot of times when you're casting upstream or you're casting perpendicular to the bank and coming straight in, the bites are pretty subtle. So you're watching little movements in your line. You're not necessarily going to get that big where your rod bends over, you feel the dink, dink, dink. Because with the moving water and the fish are moving, if you have any slack in your line, which you want as you're floating those baits down through those seams, a fish will grab it, have it in its mouth, and be moving away from you, moving towards you, retreating back into where it was hiding. And so all of a sudden, you might get a big bow in your line, and you think you're stuck on something, so you start to reel up, and then all of a sudden you realize your line is swimming the other direction. And so that's a part of, there's no substitute for fishing. You can watch all the videos you want in the world. There's no substitute for being out there and learning those subtle intricacies of fishing on moving water, because a lot of times it's just something as simple as your line twitching. And so when you're casting downstream with something like this and you're just slowly working it back up, obviously the line's moving back towards you. So anything that's looking to hit it is going to be hitting it from back behind the bait. So when it hits it, it's more than likely going to grab it and either turn directly back where it was coming from or dive down, which creates that classic big, heavy tug hit on the line. So twin tails or skirted twin tails, again, these are mimicking either crawfish, frogs, or sunfish that are moving upstream. So the skirted one can be a little intimidating, but it's exactly the same as the other twin tail. All you're doing is you run that hook right through the head, up the hook shank, and then out through the side that's perpendicular to the tail. So your tail should always be outside and your hook point should be facing this way. And this one, if just the classic twin tail isn't getting reaction, having a little bit of extra up here on the front when it's in the water is going to help with those reaction type bites. So this actually looks like your classic bass jig with the trailer, but it's all built into one plastic. So again, this could look like a fleeing sunfish, or it could look like a crawfish that's moving up, but you'd fish it the same way. Cast it down into that deep pool, straight downstream, let it fold to the bottom, and then slowly pick the rod tip up so it flutters upward, and then let it fall. And when it falls, you're picking up the slack in the line, and do that until you get it all the way back in. Baits like this, now this is a 5-inch twin tail on an 1/8 ounce hook. Most of your creeks in Oklahoma, like Sycamore Creek, Buffalo Creek, Barron Fork, this is too big. You're looking for a bass that is 14 inches to be able to grab something like this. Now, you'll get 6-inch fish that'll grab the back end of this and it'll drive you crazy all day because they don't get anywhere near that hook. So while you may be getting bit all day and like, why can't I set the hook? Why can't I set the hook? It's just because that fish isn't having the opportunity to inhale the backside of it to get to where that hook point is, which is why this 2-inch tube is kind of the great equalizer for all the things that we've talked about to this point that are subsurface baits. This will catch a 16, 17, 18-inch smallmouth, no problem. Now, whether or not you can keep it on a 32nd ounce hook, that's where the fun of river fishing comes into play. But this is going to open up your opportunity to catch just a plethora of species. So instead of going to a creek and only catching one fish, if you use this exact bait here on any of the creeks we've talked about, you're now going to catch 20, 30, 40, 50 fish in that same fishing trip. They might not all be the fish you're targeting. Like if you're going out to fish for smallmouth or spotted bass, you're going to catch a lot of bycatch. So you'll catch rock bass and sunfish. You might catch a drum. You might catch a buffalo. You might catch a sucker, depending on how you're fishing it and what those fish are feeding on that particular day. But downsizing is always the key. And another good one for downsizing are these little Bobby Garlands. So this is kind of like our Fluke, but these are really, really small. So again, we're using a 32nd ounce hook or a 16th ounce hook. But you can see where the back end of the bait to where the relationship of the hook point is. That's a big key. If the back of your bait is 4 or 5 inches from your hook point, then obviously you're looking for a fish that's got a big enough mouth on it that when it inhales it, the hook point can then catch the front of the mouth. So downsizing is always downsize before switching up completely. So if you go into a creek and you're fishing a twin tail, or you're fishing a big grub like this, and you're getting bit, but you're not hooking up, that means you're on the right pattern. You have the right color, you're fishing at the right depth of the water column, or you're fishing in the right spot on the river. So instead of switching up your bait and using just something different, always go to the river with something that, you know, similar baits that you can downsize to. That's usually the number one problem of anglers when they're not catching fish. It's not so much that they're not using the right pattern. The pattern is just too big. And what we mean by pattern is all fish are looking for a very particular food source on a given day, or throughout the course of the day, they may change what their pattern is. And so all of these are meant to mimic different patterns within the river system. So it could be a crawfish, it could be some type of insect, it could be bait fish. So if you're getting bit, you're on the right path. And if you're not hooking up, then if you have something that's either the same exact bait, but it's in a smaller size, always downsize your hook, always downsize your lure before changing what you're doing or leaving a spot where you are getting bit. That's usually the problem. And then sometimes, you know, like something like this, this is a 2-inch one, this is an 1.5 inches. They're almost the same size, but just that little bit extra tail right there, if you downsize to the 1.5 inches, that could be the difference between, you know, you landing 50 fish and you landing 15 fish. So always downsize, 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 downsize until you start to get more consistent hookup rates. So again, these little Bobby Garland baby shad, this one is obviously mimicking, again, a green sunfish, a long-ear sunfish, something that has that type of bright color, or a classic pearl or ghost white, same deal. And to rig these ones, just like some of the other ones where how you put the hook in is important, these have a base on them. So you can see that the back is flat. That blue, that's the top of the bait. That's completely flat. And then the green on the bottom, you can see the little bit of a bow for a belly. So when you put your jig head on, so this is just a little 32nd ounce jig head, you go right through the nose of the bait. And that hook point, when you work it down and work the plastic up the shank of the hook, you want that hook point coming out on that back. So on the blue side, the flat side, so that when it's rigged up and that hook point comes out, that hook point should be on the top, because jig heads are meant, the weight of it, the hook point is always straight up. So if you're reeling a jig head like this, if you were to cast out a empty jig head with nothing on it and reel it straight in, it wouldn't reel in like this. So if this is the bottom of the body of water and this is the surface, and you cast out a jig head, it's never going to swim in like this. They're meant to swim hook side up. So knowing how your plastic was meant to have a top and a bottom, and some of them aren't. Some of them are their unit. So you could have them either way, doesn't matter. But it is important when you're using baits that do have a top and a bottom. They obviously aren't labeled. You know, there's not a little deal right here that says bottom of bait, top of bait. So understanding what the top and the bottom are important, because if you were to rig this through the bottom, it's not to say that you wouldn't catch a fish or two, but it's not going to swim right. And again, we're trying to mimic as natural of a presentation as possible. And these types of baits were meant to, when they go through the water, that this little tail is creating the same pulse as a normal bait fish would. So again, that'll probably catch you fish, but you always want to be using the baits the way that they were intended to be built. But plastic baits are meant to be manipulated. So if you showed up at a river and this was all you had, and this is a 5-inch stinger, and this is just way too big, there's just, you know, if you put your jig head on this, your jig head would be your hook point would be all the way up here. So you have all this bait right here, right? Well, the great thing about soft plastics is they're very easy to manipulate. So I don't want to use all this top part. I just want the base of it, because I know this watermelon and red and black is the right pattern. I cut it right below where normally the little slit that's right here where your hook point would come through. I cut it right below that to create my own 3-inch plastic. And then you would just bait that. And again, this one doesn't have a top or a bottom, so that hook point can come out either side. But there, now we've just created our own little plastic bait, and it didn't, come in the bag that way. So now this is very effective because, again, as this is hitting the bottom, that current coming through is just creating that little pulse. And what that does is it stimulates the lateral line of a fish, and it's signaling to it that there's a distress signal coming from a bait in the water. And most of these soft plastics are impregnated with salt, garlic, different types of smells. So it's letting off a scent line. So not only are they getting that stimulation with the vibration, but they're also getting, their other senses through smell triggering as well. So if you have a bunch of plastics in your bag, even a lizard, sometimes you cut a lizard in half and all you have is the back legs and that tail. You work that through a jig head, and fishing in creeks, manipulating those soft plastics can go a long way. Now, there are ones that are specifically made to be fished either as trailers or singular. So like this is a little river bug. So this is, again, could mimic like a tube. It's meant to mimic a multitude of different prey options. So you have your tail and some appendages that come off the back that could either be mimicking the backside of a crawfish, or if it's coming through the water, that could look like the tail of a fish. So it could be mimicking, again, another bait fish. So tubes and little creature baits and stick baits are just the most versatile because they're mimicking the most types of species, which means you don't have to pattern as specifically. So they're great search baits to figure out what fish you're looking for. If you go in and you just start throwing this to begin with, well, then you have to hope that the fish that are in there are keying in on bait fish, because this is not going to mimic a crawfish. This is mimicking a small bait fish. So if at that time when you're on a creek or river, they're not targeting bait fish, they're looking subsurface off the bottom, or they're looking for insect larvae that's floating down, things like tubes, mud bugs, river bugs, little stick worms. Those are going to give you the best option of mimicking a multitude of prey items without actually having to key in on what that specific prey item is. So something like this is obviously flatter than it is when it's on its back. So your appendages down here at the bottom. So when you're rigging this up, you don't want to come straight down the back like this and come out the skinny side unless you were planning on just straight swimming it in. So if you're doing this, it's going to hold more of a vertical profile. So you're mimicking more of a swimming bait fish. But you can accomplish both of those things by going through and coming out the fatter side by working it down the hook shank and then coming out and working it up like that. So now you can either cast it straight downstream like we had talked about earlier, and work it up like that and let it fall, or you can reel it straight in. And again, you're creating that vibration. And sometimes when those fish, because they're always looking up, they're looking upstream and they're looking up towards the surface to feed, because all predatory fish are ambush. So they're always looking to hit their prey item from behind or from underneath so that they don't see it coming. Very rarely will you have a fish, come head, they'll see it coming up and go head on to your bait because they want the element of surprise to come in and hit it. So from below or from behind looking at that, that's either going to, again, mimic a crawfish, or it's going to mimic a bait fish that's moving upstream, or a frog, or some type of insect that might be in the water that, has some type of movement. So those are kind of your basic plastics. And to kind of summarize what we went through, we have our stick bugs, stick worm, very, very effective, very versatile. We have our river bugs or mud bugs, and the ribs. So you're giving off all these pulsations, which are stimulating those lateral lines of fish. You might have a crawfish imitation bait where it's got, again, you got the claws. So if you get a crawfish bait, don't go through where the little plastic, where it's supposed to be the head of it. You're going through what the back end of it would be again, and then working down up the hook shank and then working it up so that it comes out. And the head of the crawfish is down here with his little hands. So when you cast him downstream and he lands, pulling him up, letting him fall, pulling him up, letting him fall. Then we have our tubes. So again, the Squirmin Squirt in green pumpkin with red and black flake, I've found to be the best Oklahoma Clearwater Creek plastic of any of them. They consistently outfish other tubes of the same kind that are in a slightly different natural coloration. That's another thing. You know, obviously all the baits that I've just shown you are very natural colored, green pumpkins, watermelon with red and black, or some very light teal, or, you know, this is considered like green and black, but it gives off kind of a chartreuse or a chartreuse or a teal or a green pumpkin, you know, with the base through the body. You'll get more of an orange coloration of the body as opposed to a green pumpkin or a watermelon. It's more of an orange. So those are going to be, you know, your natural colorations. Obviously the white fluke, we are looking for reactionary. And then with these, you know, you're mimicking one of your more flashy shiner fish, but typically going to a Clearwater Creek, you want to stay away from colors like pink and, you know, bright purple, bright blue, things that just naturally wouldn't be occurring in the water. It's not to say you're not going to pick up some reactionary bites, but overall, the consistency of the fishery and how many fish you get into will be severely limited by not sticking to natural colorizations that you're going to find in the water. And you can do that when you first show up to a creek. Turn over a couple of rocks. Look at what the color of the crawfish that are in that particular body or section of river are, because they change. They'll change throughout the course of a river. They'll change throughout different sections of a river. You might fish 1 mile and you might have a big drop off. So you might have something that separates you know, easy movement of fish and crayfish upstream and downstream, like a waterfall or something like that. So when you get to those types of areas where you've really transitioned from, you know, a body of water where you're like, okay, this is where fish are holding, and then you go over a huge fall, you get that a lot at Blue River, where you've now segmented your river. So the species that are existing in the pool below the waterfall versus the run above it might be vastly different in coloration and how they've adapted to live from the environmental factors of where they're at in that section of river. So turning over rocks and just looking, paying attention, you know, Clearwater streams, you can see most of the fish swimming around, especially your prey fish, because they're not looking to be hidden. They find their protection in numbers. So you'll see them schooled up in these big schools, and to bigger fish, they're less likely to swoop in and try to hit them. Like you would see maybe on a pond or a reservoir, where you'll see a bass come into a big school of bait fish on the bank to break them up. That's their defense mechanism. So you can glean a lot into what colors or what you should be looking for as far as pattern, just by when you get to a body of water, you get to a section of river, just look, just sit there for 5 minutes and just watch the water, watch movement. You can learn a lot from just being still and watching, especially the clearer the water, you can see more. So that kind of covers the basic plastics that you would need to use in Oklahoma. Like I said, if you find one that you're really comfortable with, that you know how to work and you've had success with it, because that's the biggest part of fishing. There's no right or wrong lure. There's no you know, be all end all bait that's just you know, vastly superior to another. Certain colors are going to have more success in certain areas just because the more natural you can mimic the prey of the fish you're chasing, the better opportunity you have. But when you find things you're confident with, downsize, get it to where it just fits in your pocket, because the worst thing you can do as an angler is be disorganized when you're out on the water, be dealing with tackle boxes, backpacks, things like that. Those are going to become frustrations. And you're going to find more joy in just getting out on a day of wet wading or being in your kayak when you've really simplified what it is you need to throw. Because I know I can go to any Clearwater Creek in Oklahoma and just throw this tube. And if I'm not catching fish, and I've tried maybe a fluke, I've maybe, you know, changed up some sizes, but I've stayed within those natural patterns and I'm not catching fish, the bite's probably just not on. I got enough of a data set now from fishing enough for as many years on the same bodies of water at the same periods of time, to know that if I'm not getting bit, either the water temps are not right, especially early season and late season. So you'll get to a point where it just gets too cold and those fish will shut down, or in the spring, vice versa. It just hasn't quite gotten warm enough. And then in the middle of the summer, it gets too hot. And then if you're not pitching to shaded areas and you're just throwing it right out into runs and seams that have direct sunlight on them, those fish have taken shelter and have shut down because it costs them a lot of energy to deal with, the changing water temperatures and oxygen levels and things like that. So if you can find a few soft plastics that you feel confident with and just throw them into a little baggie that fit in your pocket with your nippers and your pliers, it's really just going to improve your joy of being able to be out on the water without having to worry about switching up a bunch of tackle and not feeling confident like you have the right thing to catch fish on that body of water. So from there, we'll move into some of the hard baits that you could potentially use. Obviously, morning and evening hours, low light, bass and predatory species are much more likely to come to the surface. Again, they have to, even if you're the biggest, baddest fish in the river, their DNA is programmed to be hesitant to putting themselves into dangerous situations. So coming to the surface for a fish then puts them at danger of getting hit by any type of avian predator. Or in some cases, there might be some terrestrial predators that will sit on the bank. You see the videos in Alaska of bears that will sit in the water and they get those fish as they're coming up waterfalls or they're trying to hit them. So every fish has its DNA programmed for safety first, and then feeding second. So the only times that you really get on a good topwater bite are going to be in those low light hours of early in the morning or late in the evening. But it's fun. I mean, watching a fish come up and grab a bait where you have that visual stimulation for not only the fish, but for the angler. A lot of people live and die by just topwater fishing. For fishing the creeks of this state, you don't want to go much bigger. So this is 1 7/8 inches. As you can see, here's my index finger. It's not even the same size, it doesn't even get down to the knuckle. So we're not dealing with something overly big. 2 inches less, 3 inches and under. This one is a little torpedo, Hedon torpedo. It's got little propeller back here that free spins when it's in the water. And so how you fish these is you can either just straight slow retrieve them and it'll create a little bit of wobble, but this back propeller or the torpedo will just be constantly, and what it does is it creates this little bit of sound on the water. And if the water is really rushing, you're not going to be able to hear it, but those fish, they can pick up the sound. And what it sounds like is it sounds like a struggling bait fish on the top or a struggling terrestrial that's trying to make it across the water. And then that's stimulating that bite. So this is just your basic shad coloration of a Hedon torpedo. And then this is called the brown crawdad pattern, but they're the same exact lure. These are both pretty effective. A fish might key into what that underbelly color is. So this is going to be stimulating more like a crawfish that may have made its way up to the top, a big grasshopper. This is going to be more of a bait fish that's up at the top. So try both if you're ever fishing those late evening hours or early morning hours. If you're not getting bit in a hole that looks fishy and you can see some action, especially if you're seeing some surface rising, just switch up the color before you change baits entirely. Another good one are Zara puppies. So these ones don't have torpedoes on the back end of them, and they're not meant to be fished with just a steady retrieve. It's more of a pop. So you're using, if this was the tip of the rod tip and I'd cast it out, all I'm doing is I'm pointing the tip of my rod tip straight at where the bait is landed, and I'm just doing this. That rod tip is just going, snapping it as you're reeling. So you're going to be slowly retrieving and just popping that rod tip. And what that does is this works its way through the water like this. as it's working it. So it just snaps back and forth as it's working its way towards you. And just like the torpedo, it's just stimulating that fleeting prey. It makes it look like there's some type of prey that has gotten itself in a bad situation where it's struggling. It's stimulating either a visual sense from fish that are targeting upward, or you're stimulating their lateral line where they can key in on where that stimulation was coming from and then go and target. So Sara puppies are equally as effective, but again, you know, it's about the same size as the tip of my index finger to my knuckle, so not very big. You're not using big chug and plugs that you'd use for stripers or largemouth bass. You want to try to keep everything that you're using on a river, and even some of these plastics that consider themselves 5 inches, I'm really not taking the tail or the skirt into account. I'm just looking at what the body of it is. And again, that's not more than 2.5, 3 inches. So 3 inches is kind of your, if you're looking at the body of the bait, anything less than that of where the hook points are going to be at, that's what you should be focusing on, even on some of the bigger bodies of water, like the upper Illinois, like the upper Mountain Fork, some stretches of the Glover and some of the deeper holes and things like that. And then you can also try crankbaits. I don't use them. That's just my personal preference. I like fishing finesse with tubes, but to each their own, and there's always effectiveness in each type of fishing. But little lipped crankbaits, something that's not meant to dive more than like 3 feet below the surface. You know, this is just a basic shad color that works pretty well in Oklahoma, nice little blue back. Or you can go more the crawfish route, where you're using, you know, reds and things like that. And these are just going to be, you're either casting straight perpendicular with current. So if you were standing on one bank casting directly at the other and the current's moving through, you're either going to want to be casting straight across, slightly upstream. And when I mean slightly, not more than like 5-10 degrees, because if you get it too far upstream, the water's moving your line out ahead of you and you can't crank enough to get it actually swimming underwater. So what will happen is if you cast it too far upstream, it'll land on the surface and you'll be trying to get it underwater, and it's just going to kind of be doing this, and then you'll get your line wrapped around your treble hooks and things like that. So these crankbaits, if you have any type of movement in the water, go straight perpendicular or it all the way up to like 45 degrees downstream, because these are meant with the lip on it to use the tension against the water to dive. And that's what creates that nice little shake on the back end, keeps them up, and then the balls that are inside of them make those nice rattles. So anytime you're fishing crankbaits or hard baits that are meant to be straight retrieved but go subsurface, don't cast way upstream and work back down. You just won't get those things to fish the way that they're meant to fish. A shiner color where you got a black back, little gold body, red eye. These are kind of your common colors. Here's one that's more just a basic black back and silver through. But again, you could get crazy with colorations. You can use the tiger fire patterns or purple, different types. But again, if you're sticking with colors in your crankbaits or any of your baits that are more of a natural coloration within the water column, you're going to find more fish. Not to say that you won't catch fish using some of the more vibrant chartreuses and things like that. But typically, natural is always your best bet. And then the last of our, or second to last of our non-fly fishing artificials are going to be either a pre-mold. You can use a pre-molded swim bait. So we talked about like the Flukes and stuff. So Storm makes, and there's several different brands, but Storm makes kind of the hardiest ones that last the longest. They're a little bit more expensive, but they hold up pretty well. So this is just like 1.5 inch, 2 inch basic bluegill Storm wild-eyed shad. So they come pre-molded, the hook's already in it. I think this one is like 3/16 of an ounce, or 3/8. Not very heavy, but it'll sink down, and you can fish these anyway. You can cast them straight downstream, work them right back towards you with the steady retrieve, perpendicular straight back to you, or upstream and kind of let them fall down. And these can be Pre-molded swim baits can pretty much be fished anywhere you want them. You can jig them, you can straight retrieve, you can reel them really fast, keep them up on the surface to fish them almost like a top water, or you can let them fall all the way down to the bottom and just slow crawl them back to you where you're dragging pebbles and stuff like that on the bottom. Coloration doesn't really matter, but again, this is just a typical bluegill pattern, so natural, something that your predatory fish, especially bass, are going to see a lot of in a river that isn't going to make them think. It's not something that I'm not used to seeing. I mostly just use these in like ponds or creeks that have a lot of still water in them. If you don't have a lot of movement, like Sycamore Creek, Buffalo Creek, parts of Barron Fork that just don't have that rush of water coming through because they're much shallower areas. So when you get deeper pools, that water's barely moving through. If you can't get bit because the fish have a lot of time to look at a tube or something, and they get wise to that, sometimes you need to reel a little bit faster, create more of a reactionary bite. That's when things like this can come into play. And then rooster tails, same principle, slow moving water where you really need to cause a reactionary bite, because in crystal clear water, these fish get a great look at it. The faster the water's moving, the more advantage to the angler, because the fish has less time to decide whether or not it wants to eat. That's why seams that we'd shown in the video early on in the presentation, seams are always your best bet on a river, especially when you have incredibly fast water compared to the consistency of the river. So you're always going to have stretches where the water is moving much faster in a section than it is in another section. In those faster sections, if you have deeper water with boulders, structure, things that create lots of seams, those are always your best opportunity to catch bigger fish and more fish, because they have less time to key in on what it is that you're throwing. Because even as close as we are to matching the natural prey with a tube or with a little creature bait or a stick worm, it's still not real. And you give any fish enough time in slow water, especially when it's crystal clear, to really look, you will see a lot of fish follow all the way to your leg if you're standing in the water. I mean, they'll swim between your legs and give up. And so when you get into slow, big pools where the water is barely moving, go into rooster tails, things with a little bit of flash that you can fish really fast, and that fish wants to, a lot of times they'll be a long ways away and it's ripping in a lot faster, more of a fast retrieve, medium to fast retrieve, as opposed to most of the plastics we talked about. You're barely doing anything. Very slow popping motions, letting the current take it, make it look like it's a natural bait that's just floating with whatever the speed of the water is. But when you get in that still water or very slow moving water, fast stripping or fast retrieving with spinning gear, bait casting, stripping would be with your fly rod black. These are kind of my go-to rooster tails in the state. So this is just a classic rooster tail. It's a cylindrical body. There's nothing to it. Looks like a little pop can, gold spin on it. This is a brown color. This is very, very consistent. And then this is a Vibric rooster tail. So the body is more conal, but still a little bronze or gold plated inline spin. So when it's going, this is spinning around the shank of the lure. So the straight shaft that goes down, it's not an offset like a spinnerbait, like your classic spinnerbait that you'd be thinking of for like bass, where the blade is down here and the bait's over here where you get that 90 degree. This is just an inline spinner. And so it's just working its way around. So it creates a flash with the coloration. And then olive green is another very consistent color. I like the Vibric ones when I can find them. I've never been able to find one with the brown, so I just keep with the classic rooster tail, but this is a Vibric rooster tail. So we got olive green, brown, and black, very primary natural colors. If you fish rooster tails a lot, there's lots of options. There's fish colored ones, that mimic trout or bass or perch or bluegill or different weird species. I mean, they might be labeled each one, some of them might just say red, other ones might say red chub or shiner and things like that. But sticking with your primary colors, green, browns, blacks, again, I feel just are more consistent overall. Doesn't mean you won't catch fish on a hot pink rooster tail or a white rooster tail. It's just in clear water, natural colors just tend to do a lot better. than if you're fishing in stained water where you're really, you're trying to get as many senses going as you can. When the fish can't visually pick up, you might want to be using chartreuse or something like that. But again, the difference between a reservoir or still water, when the water gets off colored, if you're in a creek or a river, oftentimes if you've had some flooding, high rain or runoff, and that water stains in any way, and typically, it's more consistently clear than it is stained, avoid those days of fishing. If you know the water's stained and 350 days a year it's not, but there's 15 days a year where you get runoff or flooding and it's stained, don't fish the stained days. You might pick up a fish or two, but it really stuns kind of their environment and usually shuts them down, especially when it's a clear water creek. Now, if it's a stained creek that might have some warm water species in it that you target, like a largemouth bass or bluegill or catfish, and then you get certain runs of fish that obviously move up, like walleye or white bass, that's a very different scenario when you have that mud bottom or anything that creates a stain in the water where it's more consistently stained than it is clear. All the stuff we've talked about today are for bodies of water in the state that are more often clear than they're not clear. So natural colors, always your go-to. Now, if you're fishing the Illinois, or you're fishing something where you can really get into some deep water. And by deep water, I mean anything over like 8 foot in a hole. You're really not going to run into that on Barron Fork. You're really not going to run into that on Blue River. You're looking at your deepest parts are probably going to be 6, 7, maybe 8 feet if you find a really, really deep hole. But most of the fishing is going to be done between 2 and 6 feet. The Illinois offers some opportunities to really get into some holes that are maybe 12, 13, 14, 15 feet deep. And when you get that, you really need to get down a lot deeper than what an 1/8 ounce jig head would get you to, because that current's going to push it out of the strike zone. Go into like a 1/4 ounce bladed jig. So most people know these as chatterbaits. So you attach up here on the blade of the jig. So when it's pulsating through the water, it's creating vibration and noise. And because it's this nickel plated, it's also giving off a lot of a flash. Now you can equip this hook. You can fish it just like this. Some people do. They just use the skirt. Most people add trailers to it. That's just kind of how professional bass fishing has really kind of triggered that, of people seeing jigs and then seeing trailers off of jigs. Your skirted jig is just meant to mimic a bait fish. So when it's pulsating through the water, this just looks like a bait fish that's running. So adding trailers, just adding to the stimulation to trigger a bite. So any of the plastic baits that we've shown outside of the tubes, because the tubes that I showed were too small to fit on this, you could use a much larger tube, a 4 or 5 inch tube. And instead of threading it up with the jig head first going into the body, you would just go through the head of it and then it'd be hanging off the back. So, you could use something like this with your little river bug or your twin tail grub. And it's the same principle as it was with regular jig head, just threading it through the head, working it down the hook shank, popping it out, and then working it up onto that holder up by the head. So you'd fish this just like we talked about with the twin tails originally. You'd be casting this straight downstream into a really deep hole, letting it fall down to the bottom, and then you'd be working it back up current very slowly. So it'd be coming right off the bottom, it'd land like this, and then it would be fluttering upward and then back down, and then fluttering upward. This is just adding more stimulation for the fish. It's a bigger bait. You might trigger a bigger bite. That's not always the case. Bigger lures that's not a universal equals bigger fish. You can catch the biggest fish in the river on the smallest thing you want to throw. It's just depending on what they're keying in on. But overall, a very small fish isn't going to be able to get this in its mouth. So you do know that if you hit something with something of this size, because again, if we're doing the finger test, it's about the same size, but obviously the hook trailer is way far back, much bigger profile. So even when we were using something that was this length, but the hook was up here and it was lower profile, you have to have a fish that's going to be able to get its mouth at least up over that for you to be able to set the hook. So that if you get into something like this with your bladed jig and you hit a fish coming up, it's probably going to be a decent fish. I mean, it's probably going to be 14, 15 plus inches that's going to come get this. So this is a good option to have, especially if you're floating and you have your kayak and you have a couple of rods rigged up. You know, always have your tube rigged up or your small creature, your small swim bait, and then maybe your 2 rods off the back. You just always have like a bait caster with some heavier line on it that's going to be holding something like this, just in case you hit that. You're not going to find a whole lot of it in the Oklahoma waters. Like every run isn't going to be this big deep hole, but it's always good to have one rigged up so you don't have to break down another rod to re-rig up, especially when you're floating. Always take a couple of different options. Take a micro light rod, then take like a standard 5'6" to 6'6" medium action bass rod, and then maybe a heavier spinning setup, like a 6.5 foot heavy with a 12-pound test on it, or a bait caster like 6.5 to 7 foot that's more of a medium to heavy rod set that's got 12-pound mono on it or something like that. Other than that, in these smaller creeks and clear water streams, when you are using spinning equipment, open face reels, try to keep your line under 8 pounds. The fish can see that line, so especially on bodies of water that might get heavily pressured, replace your spool before you go. So re-spool your line with fresh 6-pound, 8-pound, or 4-pound test, depending on what you're comfortable with. 6-pound is kind of that nice, happy medium zone, but 8-pound test is fine. You can get away with that if it's brand new line. If you go and you use your rod a lot, like in local ponds or stuff like that, where you're getting film on it, that will show in the water column. Some fish, doesn't matter to them. They don't pay attention. Other bodies of water, they are super keyed in on anything that's unnatural. So it's always a good idea when you go to a clear water creek to fish that you have fresh line on your spool that's under 8 pounds. That's going to give you the best opportunity to pitch out a naturally looking lure that they're not going to be able to pick up any of that line as it goes either over the top of them or they can see it out in front. You'll hear fly fishermen talk about that a lot, especially with dry fly fishing, of extending your leader. How much more tippet do you need to put on to get away from your leader? Because those fish can pick up the very subtle coloration or changes in density of your line. So 6-pound mono on an open face spinning reel is really the go-to for anywhere in the state when it comes to clear water fishing. But if you have to use something different, then I would say just have a bait caster or heavier spinning reel set up with something like a bladed jig or a jig head, or maybe a 1/4 ounce just regular jig head with a bigger, like 5-inch something like this, that's rigged up ready for those big pools. Otherwise, you might just have, usually what I do is I have one rod rigged up with a weightless fluke. And this is my reactionary bite. I'll throw this up against any good bank that I come by, anything like that. I'm using the fluke. Otherwise, I'm working my 2-inch tube on a 16th ounce jig head or a 32nd ounce jig head all day long. I mean, I'm working this through every single section of river. And then if I get to a really big pool, my 3rd rod is rigged up with something like a bladed jig or a heavier jig head that's got a bigger trailer on the end of it. And I'm only using that in that deep hole and then putting it right back on the back of the kayak, moving on, coming back to the tube. So that moves us through all of our artificial non-fly fishing components. So again, we went through it. I'm going to show it just one more time here up on the screen. So we can go through what we had. So over here in the corner with the cursor, we have small lip crankbait in shad, a lipless small crankbait in a darker shad, a blackback with some silver. Then we have our Hedon torpedo in brown crawdad. Then we have our Hedon torpedo in our black shiner, lipped crankbait with a red eye that's got a black back, gold through the body, a little bit silver undertone. And then 2 small lip crankbaits, one with the red body, one with more of a brown body, but kind of the same crawdad patterns. And then we have our rooster tails in olive, brown, and black, our storm pre-molded swim baits Some of those Squirmin Squirt tubes are different arrays of hooks. Here's a small size 1 Wacky Rig hook. Then we have our 1/8 ounce Stinger jig heads. Then we have a 16th ounce and 2 32nd ounce squirt head jig heads. Again, these are meant to be paired with the tubes. The 16th ounce work the best with the 2-inch. The 32nd ounce work the best with the 1.5 inch. You can stick a 16th ounce in the 2 1/4 inch tube, but an 1/8 ounce is usually better, just because of the eye hole on the 16th ounce doesn't stick out as far away from the lead. So sometimes it's hard to get that eyelid completely through the plastic to be able to hook your line to. So the 1/8 ounce one gives you just a little bit more of a stem on the eye lid to poke through the plastic. Then we have our 4/0 offset worm hook that we use for our flukes. You could use them for the dingers, but I primarily just use them to fish weightless with the fluke. And we have our bladed jig head here. This is a 1/4 ounce bladed jig head. Here's a jitterbug, a surface bait. Again, you cast it either perpendicular to you or a little bit downstream, just a straight steady retrieve, and it's wobbling through the water. Our Zara puppies. Again, remember, top water, focus on the first hour of the morning, last hour of the evening. Our 5-inch dinger, our 4-inch dinger, and remember, you can always, if you don't have 3-inch little stick worms, but you got some 5-inchers or 4-inchers, take some scissors or even just use your hands to pinch it off to cut it down, so you can throw it on one of your hooks, either the Wacky Rigged or with the jig head. Then we have our baby shad, our Bobby Garlands with either on, this is on a 16th ounce jig head, this is on a 32nd ounce jig head, and then so 32nd, 16th, and 1/8 ounce jig head. Typically in Oklahoma streams, I don't carry anything bigger than 1/8 ounce, with the exception of a bladed jig, or maybe just a handful of like 1/4 ounce jig heads that I use almost never, but always good to just have a couple on you in case you have to switch it up. We have our Fat Albert single tail, curly tail grub. Then we have our twin tail grub, our twin tail skirted grub. Both of these are Chompers brands. They come infused with garlic and salt. And then we have our river bug right here and here. And then we have our 2 crawfish patterns. And then obviously the pack, like I talked about, comes in a 15 pack, but I got about 40 pre-rigged in here with 32nd ounce. I know I can throw that in my pocket. And then all I need is my nippers and my pliers to get me through a day of either wade fishing or float fishing out. So now, as kind of a bonus for anybody who wants to watch this video, who's curious about taking a fly rod out onto any of these bodies of water, most people think of fly fishing either for saltwater or for trout fishing, but it's becoming increasingly popular for warm water species, whether it be carp or bass in moving water or in still water. We're obviously talking about moving water, so I'm going to pull a couple of these different fly patterns over that we can talk about. And again, these are sharing pretty much the same principles as we did with just all of our artificial non-fly fishing equipment. So the way that I'm going to talk about these flies is essentially how I'm going to be talking, or what I just talked about, and how they're mimicking essentially the same thing. It's just a different method of fishing. And it's always good to expand your horizons as an angler. So if you've been spin fishing or bait casting or spin casting fishing your entire life, you know, and you either have a fly rod that you maybe got as a gift, or you just picked it up one time and thought, oh, I'll use it, but then you never got around to it because you didn't have any instruction or know where to go or know what to use. We'll try to pick through a few of those things because a fly rod is very fun. It's as fun of fishing as anything else. So having the option of, you know, taking a few different types of rods with you, especially on some wade fishing, like Barron Fork is a great place to fly fish. You got big open banks. You don't have to worry about back casting. That's kind of the tricky thing in Oklahoma waters. Blue River, the Glover River, portions of the Mountain Fork, you run into these really tightly banks where you don't have any type of back casting ability unless it's straight downstream. So if you're not a creative caster with some roll casting, it's not as much fun because you're limiting your opportunity to be able to put the fly where it needs to be for the fish to get it. But Barron Fork, Sycamore Creek, Buffalo Creek areas, the upper Illinois, where you really have the classic kind of pebble line banks where you don't have the riparian zone necessarily on both banks. You might have it on one bank, but the other bank is more of kind of a flood zone where you have your washed out, your rock beach. You don't get that at Blue River. You have the riparian zone on both sides, so you have trees lining both sides of the bank. Makes it a little bit more difficult to cast. So I'll start with subsurface first, and then we'll work our way up to top water. A basic Clouser minnow. You're going to see those at any fly shop in America, and then at places that might just sell a few flies but aren't necessarily a fly shop. You're going to find Clouser minnows everywhere. This is a very basic subsurface lure that you're just going to cast that thing out just like we talked about with think of this one as our fluke. So you're casting this either straight perpendicular with you or 45 degrees upstream to the bank away from you. When that thing hits the water, you're letting the current bow your fly line out. So with this, with the standard fly setup on all of the creeks and streams, you don't really need anything more than a 6 weight. 5 weight's fine, a 3 weight's fine. You're probably using a 9-foot leader, like 4X, with some 6X tippet on it. With something big like this, where it's more of a jig head, this is heavy. It doesn't fly like your dry fly. So, it's not going to be the prettiest cast ever throwing jigged flies. So you might just want to go 4X tippet onto your 4X leader and give yourself a couple feet of chew line so that you can, tie a couple different patterns a streamer on, but you really don't need to get that fly line. You don't need 6 feet of tippet for dry fly fishing where you're worried about the visual presentation. This streamer fishing is more about the tug. So you're really letting the current do the work for you. So when you're casting it upstream and your fly line catches that water, what it's doing is it's pulling your fly down and across current. And as it's getting cross current, you're just making quick burst strips right off your reel. So like 6-inch strips. And all that's doing is it's just very subtly moving this fly back towards you. And those fish are going to either hit it from downstream up or they were going to be chasing it down. But most of the time, the bite with these comes right at the tip or at the point of the swing. So if it's upswing or if it's upstream of where your fly line is bowing back this way, when it gets to the end of where you now have tension between the bow and the line and where your knot is at on your fly, that's when it gets that big, heavy rip through. That's generally where the bite comes. But never give up on a swing. A fish might grab it before you've even gotten into the swing. But more importantly, you might have a lot of followers behind it. So make sure you give it 6, 7, 8 really fast twitch strips in once it's reached kind of the apex of the swing. So when it gets to here where it's now facing back towards you, give it 5, 6, 7, 8 bursts with a brief pause in between each before you pick it back up to throw out. And that'll help pick up those 2, 3, 4, 5 extra bites a day that, could be that good fish. Another one that's pretty common to use are going to be just your basic woolly buggers. You're going to fish this the same exact way as you would the Clouser minnow. They're a little bit lighter, so they're going to sink a little bit slower. Again, depending on where you're at, you may want to put a couple of pieces of split shot up your line, but it's the same principle. You're casting 45 degrees upstream or straight perpendicular, letting that water push your line down to create a bow, and then it swings it through. And again, give it 5 or 6 strip twitches right at the end, and that'll just help with the bite. I don't really talk a lot about nymph fishing for warm water species. You can, it's not as much fun. If you're going to be fishing for warm water species, and even for trout in Oklahoma, you know, if you're going subsurface, work a streamer, you know, or work a big jigged fly. So these are double jointed. These are dirty water fly co. You know, they're actually built onto a bass hook. So this is just an owner hook that's on here, and you know, it's probably, I don't know, a 1/16 of an ounce maybe. So again, it doesn't fly great. It's not that pretty cast, but very effective for bass and warm water species. Again, you're just swinging it through and then twitching it out of those little behind boulders, behind stumps, or at the end of your swing. It's just not as much fun to nymph because anybody who's familiar with fly fishing terminology, you're fishing under a strike indicator or a float, or in the non-fly fishing world, a bobber. So you're basically just casting 45 degrees or 90 degrees upstream and then letting that float down, keeping, you know, when you're nymph fishing, you don't want that big swing because you want the natural presentation, because your fly is mimicking insect larvae that's in that stage of its life cycle where it's floating down the river trying to clasp onto different rocks to fulfill its life cycle. So you're making big upriver mends. And unless you're targeting non-game species like buffalo suckers, where a nymph is the way to fish, I'd recommend doing it without a strike indicator. So classic trout anglers, a lot of times they, you know, nymphing, they're thinking you got to keep a float above it so that it's it's straight down below it and it's floating at about the same pace. You can cast out with the nymph and do the same principles where you're keeping, you know, upriver mend in your line so it's allowed to float, but then it lets it get down to the bottom. And so something, let me find a small one. So either like a rubber leg pheasant tail, a copper john, you know, something that's really small. And this isn't overly small for a nymph. This is probably this is like a 16 maybe. So it's not that small, but something like this, if you're casting out, again, like 10 degrees upstream, get a big upriver mend. And if you see some drum, or you see some suckers or some red horse, and, you know, they're clearly eating off of the bottom, like you can see the way that they're looking. If you can get this thing up ahead of them without an indicator. So what a strike indicator does is it is going to limit the amount of line of where this can drop. So the second that it's reached to where it has tension with the strike indicator, it can't go any deeper. Well, if you remove that strike indicator, you can actually get this all the way down to the bottom. And in most Oklahoma Clearwater creeks, Blue River excluded, you're dealing with mostly pebble bottom. And so you're not looking at a lot of hangups. So this thing can actually just bounce right along the bottom very slowly. And that's a good way to pick up your non-game species. And it can be really easy. They might just pick up a pheasant tail, or you might have to try on a dozen different sizes and patterns of small nymphs to key into what they are feeding on. So lightning bugs, copper johns, Bloody Marys, you know, so here's like a little Bloody Mary, you know, it's got the red body on it, or we have our classic copper john, and these are spun with that copper. So these are actually, even though they're really small, they sink very fast. So, you know, a rubber leg copper john sometimes can get it done, or a pheasant tail, but something like this. So if you ever are trying to target some non-game species in Oklahoma with nymph fishing, don't do it with the strike indicator. Just fish the same way you would with the strike indicator, just take that away. But the same principles, upriver mends, keep that slack in that line, but to where you can watch that line twitch, or you can either, a lot of times you can see the fish take. If you're really good at picking up your flies in the water as they sink, if you can see them the whole way, or you at least know what path they were on, a lot of times you can see that underwater strike without necessarily seeing the take. Otherwise, you're just watching where your line goes subsurface. So your fly line is going to be on the top. A lot of your leader is going to be on the top. And then that nymph is going to have drugged the end of your leader and your tippet down towards the bottom. So watching right where your leader is going subsurface, if you see any type of pause, twitch, whatever, you know, go back and try to set that hook. But that's the only reason I would recommend using a nymph for clear water is if you're targeting non-game species. You can and will pick up the, you know, targeted game species, but if you're going to go for them, you might, you know, you want to do it in the more exciting way, which is going to be twitching streamers or jigged flies or going topwater. And if we're looking at topwater in Oklahoma, you can use poppers and things like that. So this is a little fly popper. It mimics a, you know, terrestrial hopper, cricket, or something like that. And these you're just going to want to be casting either just slightly upstream or perpendicular or just slightly downstream to the far bank, getting it as close to cut banks as you can. And then you're just giving a quick pop. So like 1 6 to 8 inch strip of the line, and it'll do this and it'll create a little bit of splash, and it'll look like a terrestrial bug that is now landed on the water, but because it doesn't have wings, like a fly that might land to lay its eggs and then be able to retake off. Terrestrials are trying to get back to the bank or dry land in any way they can. So this is a popper one. So this is meant to actually be worked with the fly line. Another hopper that is meant to just be drifted. It's going to look something like this. There's tons and tons and hundreds, if not thousands, of different hopper terrestrial ant patterns, you know, dry terrestrial bug patterns. Sometimes trout key in on a very particular bug in a very particular section of river because they know what the bottom of it looks like. Warm water bass in Oklahoma tend to be a little bit less picky. So basically anything that's got a yellow, orange, brown body on the underbelly that floats. And this is going to be the same principle that you would have had nymphing. You're going to cast it 45 degrees upstream to your cut bank or behind a seam in a big rock, or seams off a structure, and you're going to throw a big upriver mend into your fly line, and you want that thing landed on the water. And with terrestrial bugs, unlike dry fly fishing for trout or other species that are taking on the surface where you are trying to mimic an actual fly that, you know, lands on the surface to lay its eggs, terrestrial bugs do not land on the water gracefully because they're not meant to be on the water. They've got blown in or accidentally made a mistake and fell off of a bank. So when they hit the water, it's generally pretty aggressive. So you don't have to worry about being that quintessential, beautiful, tight arced fly line when you're throwing it out that lands just soft without any type of ripple or splash. It's almost encouraged with terrestrials to smack them down on the water because that's what the fish are looking for terrestrials that have made their way onto the water surface. But once you do get it on the surface, you want to try to keep as much of the drag-free drift as you can. But again, a little bit of movement is not the end of the world because terrestrials struggle when they're on the water. They are creating a bit of a surface. So anybody who's ever fished, you know, big bugs out west, stone flies, salmon flies, things like that, you know you can get away with a little bit of movement because that's what those fish are looking for. But outside of that kind of covers it for the fly fishing. I mean, you can try to match hatches. You know, there are certain rivers where you're going to get a good October caddis hatch. We obviously have mayflies and things like that. But if you're really want to key into matching a hatch somewhere, because you will see surface takes, especially from micro species, which are awesome to catch on a fly rod. So if you want to throw like a size 24, size 26, you know, a crippled bug or, you know, some type of mayfly pattern or pale dun pattern, and get really small, you know, I would recommend looking in, you know, Googling Oklahoma entomology. OSU has a lot of great research resources and research that they've done on bugs across the state. So if you're fishing a particular region and you really are looking in to get on those dry fly, when you see the water and the rings coming up, but they're all just tiny, tiny little fish, those are awesome. I love micro fishing. I love trying to catch the smallest fish that I can when I'm on a creek And outside of my 1.5-inch tube, I can't really get much smaller than that from non-fly fishing perspective, because you just can't cast it. Fly line allows you to cast out things that are almost microscopic because you're using the line to throw as opposed to the actual rod. So you don't need that weight to get the line out. So that's something to look into. If you really want to match the hatch, just Google Oklahoma bugs and go down that rabbit hole of looking into entomology of the different bugs and the different species, and that'll give you the best bet. But if you're just looking for summer warm water basic fly fishing instruction, terrestrials, so stimulators, hoppers, ants, if you're going subsurface, woolly buggers, streamers, jig-headed flies, and then you're pretty much your basic nymph patterns, your pheasant tails, rubber-legged yellow sallies, rubber-legged pheasant tails, copper johns, bloody marys, lightning bugs, things like that, anything with a little flash, and just mix with those patterns until you start to find some success with some of the non-game fish, because obviously the panfish are going to hit just about anything. So you throw it close to a green sunfish, a bluegill, long ear, rock bass, warmouth, anything like that, probably doesn't matter what it is. If you get it close enough to them, you're probably going to get into a lot of panfish by fishing subsurface with a very small nymph. But patterning in bigger non-game fish like buffalo, drum, river red horse, suckers, of hognose suckers are really cool to take on a fly rod. And then you have your different chubs and shiners that will obviously hit as well. And that's when you get into the micro fishing. So outside of that, this presentation will be available for anyone on our fishing resources webpage within the next 48 hours. Other than that, I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in. And until our next one, which is October 12th, I believe, October 13th, Tuesday, October 13th, we'll do fall fishing tips. So that's going to cover, we're primarily going to focus on largemouth bass in Stillwater, but we will also be talking some walleye, some white bass, some certain offshoots. But the primary topic will be targeting largemouth bass in the fall in reservoirs, lakes, and ponds. So join us then for that. Otherwise, be signing off right now. So thank you all for joining me, and I hope you learned something.